The morning they auctioned Ruth Mercer and her children, the sky over Caldwell Crossing was the color of old ash, flat and featureless, the kind of sky that didn't promise anything. It was early November, cold enough that breath came out in small white clouds, and the mud on Main Street had hardened overnight into ridges that caught at boot heels and wagon wheels alike. By 8 o'clock, most of the town had already gathered in the space between Harker's General Store and the old livery. Not because they were summoned, exactly. Word just traveled fast in a place that size. Ruth stood on the wooden platform that had been dragged out and set up near the hitching post. It wasn't much of a platform. 3 planks laid across 2 sawhorses, the kind of thing you'd use to display sacks of grain or a saddle you were trying to unload. She stood on it anyway, because County Sheriff Dobbs had told her to, and because she didn't have the energy left to argue with men who had the law on their side. Her children stood beside her. Caleb, 14 years old and already carrying himself like someone who'd been through enough to know that the world didn't hand you anything clean, stood at her left with his fists balled at his sides. He had his father's jaw, square and stubborn, and right now it was set so hard that Ruth worried he might crack a tooth. Her middle child, Thomas, was 10, and he pressed himself against her hip and stared at the ground because looking at the crowd was too much. And then there was Lily. Lily was 6. She hadn't said a word in 11 weeks. Ruth kept her hand on Lily's shoulder the whole time, her fingers pressing lightly through the thin wool of the child's coat, just to remind both of them that she was there. Sheriff Dobbs cleared his throat and unfolded the paper he'd been holding. He was a large man who sweated even in cold weather, and he had the expression of someone doing something distasteful but necessary, which Ruth supposed was as much grace as she was going to get from him. The estate of the late Daniel Mercer, he read, being found insolvent following a review of outstanding debts and encumbrances, and having no clear male heir to manage said estate, the county has determined that the assets, including dependent family members without independent means of support, are to be disposed of at public auction, as per Territorial Ordinance 47, Section. "Get on with it," somebody in the crowd said. Dobbs folded the paper. He looked almost relieved to stop reading. "We're starting the bidding at $2. Ruth had promised herself she wouldn't look at the crowd. She looked anyway. She couldn't help it. There were maybe 60 people out there, some she recognized and some she didn't, and not one of them met her eyes. The Haggerty women were whispering to each other behind gloved hands. Old Pete Sunderland from the feed store had taken a sudden interest in the buckle on his boot. The Calloway brothers, who had owed Daniel 3 months of fence-mending wages when he died, were standing off to one side looking bored. The thing about being publicly humiliated was that it was lonelier than Ruth had expected. She'd thought she would feel rage or shame, or both at once. Instead, she felt a strange hollowness, like someone had reached inside her chest and removed something important while she wasn't paying attention. She'd had 3 weeks since Daniel's funeral to understand what was happening. The bank had come first, with a man in a gray coat who was very polite and very sorry and very firm about the numbers. The mortgage on their land Daniel had worked for 8 years, was 4 months behind. The outstanding debts to suppliers and neighbors added up to more than she could earn in 2 years of taking in laundry, which was the only work she'd been able to find. She'd asked for more time. The man in the gray coat had said he would see what he could do, and then the county had sent Sheriff Dobbs with the ordinance paper. There was a law. She hadn't known about it, but it existed. Dependent women and minor children with no male guardian and no means of self-support could be auctioned as household labor to pay outstanding debts. It was an old law, one that hadn't been used much in recent years, but it was on the books, and someone had clearly decided it applied here. She suspected she knew who that someone was. She just couldn't prove it yet. $2, Dobbs called again. Starting bid of $2 for the widow and her children. They're able-bodied. Good workers. The crowd was very quiet. Caleb made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word. Ruth pressed her hand on his shoulder, the way she was pressing on Lily's, and he stopped, but his jaw didn't unclench. The silence stretched out long enough to become its own kind of cruelty. Ruth heard the wind moving along the eaves of Harker's store. She heard a horse stamp its feet somewhere behind her. She heard Thomas take a shuddering breath against her hip. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd. $5. People turned. The crowd shifted and parted a little, the way crowds do when something unexpected happens, and Ruth saw him for the first time. He was tall, not in an exaggerated way, but in the manner of a man who simply took up more space than most. He wore a dark coat that had seen hard use, the collar turned up against the cold, and his hat was pushed back slightly in a way that might have been careless or might have been deliberate. He had a beard that wasn't quite trimmed and dark eyes that were moving over the platform with an expression that Ruth couldn't read. He looked like he was assessing livestock, which she supposed was exactly what he was doing, and she hated him for it immediately. $5, he said again, addressing Dobbs directly. I heard you the first time. I'm saying 5. Someone in the crowd muttered his name. Ruth caught it. Cole Ashford. She didn't know it, but she could tell from the way people had shifted slightly away from him, the small, unconscious clearing that happens around a man who makes others cautious, that it meant something to the people who did. Dobbs looked at his paper again, as if it might contain instructions for this situation. We have a bid of $5. Anyone? 8, said a voice to Ruth's right. She turned and saw Harlan Prue, who ran the boarding house out on the East Road. He was a narrow-faced man with quick eyes, and he was looking at Ruth and her children the way a man looks at a problem he's already figured out how to solve. She knew what he wanted. A woman who could cook and clean and had 2 boys old enough to haul wood and carry water was a significant economic asset. The fact that she'd have no choice in the matter was just the shape of the arrangement. 9, Ashford said without raising his voice. 12, Prue said. His jaw was tight now. A murmur moved through the crowd. This was more entertainment than most of them had expected. 15, Ashford said. Prue looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them. Ruth couldn't tell what, and then Prue shook his head slightly and stepped back. The crowd made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. $15, Dobbs said, sounding confused and slightly relieved. Going once? Going twice. He paused. Nobody else spoke. Sold. Caleb's head came up fast. No, he said. Not loudly, just flatly, with complete certainty, the way you say something you've decided. Caleb? Ruth's voice was quiet. No, Mama, we can't just... Caleb? She turned to look at him, and whatever he saw on her face made him stop. She didn't know what was there. Exhaustion, probably, and something harder underneath it. Not now. He pressed his lips together. His hands were still in fists, but he didn't say anything else. Cole Ashford came around the side of the crowd rather than through it, which Ruth noted. He handed the money to Dobbs without ceremony. She couldn't see what it was, coins or paper. And then he turned and walked toward the platform. He stopped at the edge of it and looked up at her. Up close, he was younger than she'd initially placed him. Maybe mid-30s. There was a scar along his left jawline, old and faded, and his hands, when he'd been reaching for his coat pocket, were rough and darkened in the way that came from years of outdoor work. His eyes, she saw now, were not cold. They were something else she didn't have a word for. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Mr. Ashford. She said it carefully, the way you say the name of something you don't yet understand. He looked at her for a moment, then at the children. At Caleb, who was staring at him with an expression that might have started a fight in other circumstances. At Thomas, who had finally looked up. At Lily, who was looking at nothing. Something moved across his face at the sight of Lily, too quick to name. I have a wagon out on the side street, he said. When you're ready. It wasn't an order exactly, but it wasn't a question either. He turned and walked away. Ruth stood on the platform and watched him go. 60 people watched her watch him, and then they began to drift away in ones and twos, back to their days, back to their business, and the morning went on as though nothing particular had happened. They didn't have much to put in his wagon. Ruth had managed to hold on to 2 trunks, one of clothes, one of a few household items she'd prioritized when it became clear that the house itself was going. And Caleb had his father's hunting knife and a worn pair of work gloves he wore even in the relative warmth of town. Thomas had a small wooden horse that Daniel had carved for him the Christmas before last. Lily had nothing in her hands. She walked beside Ruth, with her eyes focused somewhere slightly past the present, the way she'd been doing since the day Daniel died. The wagon was a good one, not new, but solid, with a canvas cover and 2 horses that looked well-fed and properly shod. Ruth allowed herself to notice that much, because the quality of a man's animals told you things. The horses were a bay and a dark gray, and they stood patient while Ashford helped load the trunks without being asked to. Caleb refused the help and loaded his own things himself. Ashford led him. Ruth helped Lily into the back of the wagon and then climbed up beside her. Thomas scrambled up without difficulty and settled against the far side, the wooden horse in his lap. Caleb sat across from them, his back against the wagon's side slat, watching Ashford with the steady, unbroken attention of a dog deciding whether something was a threat. Ashford took the driver's seat and clicked to the horses, and they started moving. For a long time, nobody said anything. The town gave way to the road, and the road climbed gradually into the foothills, the terrain shifting from the flat, muddy ground of the valley floor to something rougher and more varied, pine trees thickening on either side. Ruth watched the land change and tried to understand what she was feeling, which was difficult because she was feeling several things at once, and none of them fit neatly together. She was afraid. That was the clearest thing. She didn't know this man, didn't know where he was taking them, didn't know what he expected in exchange for $15 and the use of a wagon. She'd heard stories, not about him specifically, but about the general shape of what happened to women who ended up obligated to men in remote places with no witnesses. She knew enough to be scared. But she was also, beneath the fear, something else. Tired in a way that went down to the bone. Tired of running calculations in her head. What could they sell? What could she earn? How long until the next crisis? Tired of pretending for the children's sake that she had a plan when most of the time she was just moving forward because stopping felt worse. "Where are we going?" Caleb asked. He'd been holding the question in for a while. She could tell from the way he finally said it, like releasing pressure. Ashford didn't turn around. "My ranch. Up near the Harrow Pass." "How far?" "Day and a half in this weather. Maybe 2 if the road's bad past the second ridge." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What happens when we get there?" "You'll have a place to sleep, food, work, if you're willing to do it." "And if we're not?" This time Ashford did glance back briefly. "Then you'll still have a place to sleep and food." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly. A small, involuntary adjustment, like a door opening a crack before the person behind it remembers to keep it shut. "Why?" Caleb asked. Ashford faced forward again. The road curved around a rocky outcropping and the pines pressed closer on the left side. "That's a longer answer," he said. "I'll give it to you when we stop tonight." They stopped at dusk near a creek where a fire ring of old stones showed that others had camped before. Ashford built the fire efficiently, without fuss, and produced a cookpot and provisions from a box under the wagon seat. Ruth watched him work and tried to find something wrong with what she was seeing, because she'd learned by now that when something looks straightforward, it usually wasn't. The fire got going, water went into the pot. He had dried beans and salt pork and some onions that had gone slightly soft but were still usable, and he put them together in a way that suggested he'd cooked on the trail enough times that he'd stopped thinking about it. Thomas, who had been trying to stay still and quiet the way he always did when he was in a new situation and wasn't sure of the rules yet, finally couldn't help himself. He edged closer to the fire and watched the pot with an attention that made Ruth's chest hurt, because she knew he'd been hungry more often than she'd been able to fix in the last month. "You can sit closer," Ashford said, without looking up from what he was doing. Thomas glanced at Ruth. She nodded. He moved to a spot by the fire and sat cross-legged in the dirt with his wooden horse in his lap. "What's his name?" Ashford asked, nodding at the horse. Thomas blinked. "General? Good name for a horse." "My papa carved him." A pause. "He did good work." Thomas looked down at the little carved figure, tracing the line of the neck with one finger. "Yeah," he said. Caleb had positioned himself on a log at the edge of the firelight, half in shadow, where he could watch Ashford without making it too obvious. He was eating when the food came. Ruth had noted that he was hungry enough that the food overrode his stubbornness, which she was grateful for. But he kept watching. Ruth sat with Lily. The girl had eaten mechanically, the way she did most things now, and was leaning against Ruth's side with her eyes half closed, watching the fire with an expression that was hard to read. She'd always been watchful, even before. Now the watchfulness had a different quality, more inward, like she was listening to something that wasn't in the external world. When the food was eaten and the pot cleaned and set aside, Ashford poured himself a tin cup of coffee and sat back from the fire a little. He looked at Caleb. "You want your answer," he said. Caleb set his empty tin down. "You said you'd give it." "I did." Ashford wrapped both hands around the cup and looked into the fire for a moment before he spoke again. "I had a family, wife, a daughter, 7 years ago. There was a fever came through. The bad kind, the kind that moved fast. I was 3 days' ride away, moving cattle, and by the time I got back—" He stopped, picked up again. "The point is, I wasn't there. Couldn't do anything about it either way, but I wasn't there." Nobody said anything. The fire popped. "I've been running my ranch on my own since then," he continued. "It's not a small place. I could use help. But that's not the main thing." He looked at Caleb directly. "I was at the grain exchange 2 weeks ago. I heard men talking about what was going to happen in Caldwell Crossing, what the county was going to do with the ordinance." His jaw shifted. "I didn't like it." "So you decided to do something about it," Caleb said. There was still suspicion in his voice, but underneath it, something more complicated was happening. "I thought about it a long time," Ashford said. "I want to be straight with you about that. It's not nothing, taking on people I don't know in this kind of situation. I have my own problems, my own enemies." He paused, but I kept thinking about how I'd have wanted somebody to step in, back when I needed it, and nobody did. He shrugged, a small, uncomfortable gesture. "That probably sounds like—" "No," Ruth said. He looked at her. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to him, and she felt the weight of it. "It doesn't sound like anything wrong," she said. "I just needed to know." He nodded once. Then he poured the rest of his coffee out and stood up. "Get some sleep," he said. "Road's rougher tomorrow." The second day confirmed what the first day had suggested about Ashford's character. He was a man who did what needed doing without making a production of it. When the wagon hit a bad stretch of road mid-morning and the left rear wheel dropped into a rut deep enough to tilt the whole rig at a dangerous angle, he was down from the seat before Ruth had fully registered what was happening. And he had Thomas, and then Lily handed down, and the boxes shifted and the horses calmed before Caleb had gotten his boots properly on the ground to help. He didn't comment on the help when it came. He just put Caleb to work steadying the horses while he handled the wheel, and when the whole thing was righted and back on the road, he said good, and they moved on. Lily watched all of this from her spot on a flat rock where she'd been placed while the wagon was being fixed. Ruth watched Lily watching. The girl's face was doing something. Not much, not enough to name, but something. Her eyes had tracked Ashford's movements through the whole process. When he'd handed her down from the wagon, his grip on her had been careful and quick, the way you handle something fragile without drawing attention to the fact that you know it's fragile. And when he'd said good and turned back to the horses, Lily had watched him for another few seconds before she looked away. It wasn't anything. Ruth told herself it wasn't anything, but she kept seeing it. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon of the second day, when the light was going amber and long-shadowed across the slopes. They'd climbed steadily for the last few hours, the terrain growing more dramatic as the road narrowed and switched back through rock formations and stands of old growth pine. And then the road crested a ridge and the valley below opened up, and there it was. Ruth had been bracing herself, without quite admitting she was doing it, for something meager. A rough place that matched the rough circumstances. What she saw instead surprised her enough that she didn't say anything for a moment. The ranch house was substantial, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber and stone, with a wide covered porch running along the front. A barn sat 60 yards to the left, newer looking than the house, with a corral beside it where 2 more horses stood in the late light. There were outbuildings, what looked like a smokehouse, a root cellar, a woodshed that was stacked full to the roofline. The whole thing was set back against a natural rock formation that broke the north wind, and in front of it, the valley floor spread out in a broad sweep of grass that would be workable ground come spring. It wasn't pretty in any decorative sense. It was a working place. Every structure set where it needed to be for function, every piece of it showing use. But it was solid, more solid than anything Ruth had lived in since she'd left her parents' house to marry Daniel, and that house had been small and prone to drafts and hadn't survived the winter of '79. "This is yours," she said. "Mine in the bank's," Ashford said, which was both honest and something close to a joke, or at least as close as he seemed to get. Caleb leaned forward to see past the canvas. His expression did something complicated and private. Thomas had already stood up, the wagon's motion making him sway slightly, and was looking at the barn with an expression of concentrated interest. "Are those your horses in the corral?" "2 of them. I've got more out in the pasture." "How many?" 14 head right now. More come spring if the breeding goes right." Thomas sat back down, pressing his lips together in the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. Ruth recognized that expression too. He was making calculations the way he always did, figuring out what things meant, how they fit together. Lily was looking at the house. Just at the house, steady and long, the way she'd looked at Ashford when the wagon wheel was being fixed. They went down the slope and into the valley, and Ashford brought the wagon around to the side of the house, and then they went inside. The inside of the house was not comfortable in any soft sense. There was furniture, a long table, chairs, a wood stove in the main room, shelves along 2 walls, but it was furniture that had been bought or made for use, not for appearance, and there wasn't much of it. The walls were bare except for a few practical items hanging on pegs. It was clean, which surprised Ruth more than the outside had, because men living alone often weren't. The floors had been swept recently enough that she could tell. "Kitchen's through there," Ashford said, nodding toward a doorway. "Pantry's off the back. It's stocked." He moved to the stairs along the far wall. 2 rooms up top. The one on the left has 2 beds. I put them both in there when the house got built. Didn't have a particular use for a second bedroom. The right one's mine. I'll take a bedroll in the barn until we figure out what this—" He paused very briefly. "Arrangement looks like going forward." Ruth looked at him. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She considered arguing and then didn't. It was a reasonable thing, given the circumstances. A woman he didn't know, and her children in his house. The whole situation new and uncertain. It was also, she thought, a way of demonstrating something, though she wasn't sure exactly what. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and went back outside, presumably to unhitch the horses. Caleb had been standing in the middle of the main room, turning slowly, taking in the details with the thoroughness of someone building a map. He stopped when Ashford left. "I don't trust him," he said. "I know," Ruth said. There could be a reason for all this that we don't know about yet. Something he wants that he hasn't said." "There could be," Ruth agreed. She was moving through the kitchen doorway, looking at the shelves, which held more than she'd had access to in weeks. Dried goods, flour, a side of cured bacon, jars of preserved vegetables. "But Caleb, we were on a platform this morning. We don't have a lot of choices to compare this one against." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to keep watching him." "Good," Ruth said. "That's sensible." She began checking the state of the pantry methodically, tallying what was there and what wasn't, the way you do when you're trying to understand what a place can sustain. "Can you go bring in the small trunk, the one with the kitchen things?" He went, because she'd given him something specific to do, and specific tasks were the one thing that reliably cut through the anger and the worry and the other things that had been living in him for the past month and a half. Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Mama." "Is this our house now?" Ruth kept her hands moving over the pantry shelves. "I don't know exactly what it is yet," she said, "but it's where we're going to be for now." Thomas thought about this with visible seriousness. "It's good that the horses are here," he said finally. "Is it?" Papa said horses meant a place had staying power, that people who kept good horses were people who planned to stay. Ruth's hands went still for just a moment. "Your papa said that, did he?" "When we rode past the Crawford place, before they left." He was quiet. Then, "I think Mr. Ashford plans to stay." Ruth breathed. "I think you might be right," she said. She heard footsteps on the stairs, Caleb coming back down, the trunk bumping against the wall, and she heard the front door open and close as Ashford came back in from the yard. And outside the small square of window above the pantry shelf, the sky had gone from amber to the deep blue-gray that came just before full dark. And the wind was picking up from the north, the way it did in November when the real cold was gathering itself to move in. Winter was coming. It was going to be brutal, the way winters in high country always were, relentless and indifferent and long. But they were inside. They were inside, and the wood stove was already warm and there was food on the shelves, and for the first time in 11 weeks, Ruth Mercer could not hear any sound that suggested something was about to be taken away from her. She didn't let herself think about what came next. She just stood in the pantry of a stranger's house with her hands on the shelves, and she breathed, and she let the warmth from the stove move through the doorway and settle around her like something she'd almost forgotten was possible. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She stood there looking at Ruth, her small face still and serious in the half-light. Ruth looked back at her. Then very slowly, Lily walked across the kitchen and pressed herself against Ruth's side, the way she used to before everything went wrong, and Ruth put her arm around her daughter's thin shoulders and held on. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying right then. Outside, the wind found the eaves of the house and moved along them, testing the joints, checking for weakness. It didn't find any. Whoever had built this place had known what they were doing, had understood that the things worth keeping required more than ordinary effort to hold together. The house stood firm. Inside it, for the first time in a long time, so did Ruth. The first snow came 3 days after they arrived, and it came without the courtesy of a warning. Ruth woke before dawn to a silence so complete it had a texture to it, the particular muffled stillness that meant the world outside had been upholstered overnight. She lay still for a moment, listening to the children breathe in the other bed, Lily curled against Thomas the way she'd taken to doing, Caleb on his back with one arm thrown over his eyes even in sleep. Then she got up, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and went to the window. 6 inches at least. More coming. She could tell by the quality of the clouds, the way they sat low and heavy over the ridgeline, like something waiting to exhale. The barn was half obscured. The woodshed roof had disappeared under a smooth white slope. She heard movement downstairs and went down to find Ashford, already dressed, pulling on his coat by the front door. He glanced up when she came off the stairs. "Coffee's on," he said. "How bad is it?" "Not bad yet. I need to check on the horses in the pasture. The far gate tends to drift. If I don't get out there before it gets worse—" He didn't finish the sentence, just picked up his gloves from the hook by the door. "I'll start breakfast," Ruth said. He paused, his hand on the door latch. It was a small pause, barely a beat. "You don't need to do that." "I know," she said, which was the same thing he'd said to her in this house the first night, and he recognized it, because one corner of his mouth moved. Then he went out, and she went to the kitchen. That was how the rhythm of the ranch established itself. Not through any conversation or agreement, but through the accumulation of mornings. Ashford out before first light, checking the animals, assessing what the weather had done or was doing. Ruth in the kitchen. The children getting up in stages. Thomas first, dressed and downstairs with the speed of someone who'd decided there were things outside he needed to look at. Caleb next, slower, more deliberate. Lily last, taking her time on the stairs the way she always did now, as if she were negotiating each step separately. By the end of the first week, Ruth had reorganized the kitchen and the pantry in a way that made sense to her, and Ashford had not said a word about it. By the end of the second week, Thomas had been given the job of collecting eggs from the 3 hens in the side pen, which he took seriously enough that he'd started keeping a mental count and reporting the numbers at dinner without being asked. Caleb had begun, reluctantly at first, helping Ashford with the heavier work around the barn, carrying feed, mucking stalls, splitting the firewood that needed to be split and stacked before the harder cold settled in. Reluctantly, at first. The reluctance was something Ruth watched carefully, because Caleb had always been like his father in this particular way. He could dislike a person and still learn from them, still notice when they did something right, and that noticing worked on him whether he wanted it to or not. She saw the shift happen on a Wednesday, a week and a half in. The bay horse, the calmer of the two that had pulled the wagon, had gotten a stone bruise on her left forefoot somewhere in the pasture, and Ashford had caught it early enough to treat it, but the treatment required patience, because the horse didn't want her foot handled and kept pulling it back. Ashford was working with her in the barn, talking to the horse in a low, even voice, when Caleb came in to start the afternoon feeding. Caleb stopped and watched for a minute. Then he said, "You want me to hold her head?" Ashford looked up. "You know horses?" "Some. My papa had 2. Ashford nodded once. Caleb moved to the horse's head and took the halter, and they worked together for 20 minutes without much talking. And when the hoof had been cleaned and packed and the horse was settling, Ashford said, Good hands. She trusts you. Caleb's expression was careful and neutral, the way it always was when he was trying not to show that something had landed. She's not that hard to read, he said. No, Ashford agreed, but some people can't read her anyway. You can. They went back to their separate tasks, but Ruth, who had been crossing the yard with a bucket and had stopped at the barn door at just the wrong, or right, moment, stood there for another few seconds before moving on. She didn't say anything to Caleb about it. She didn't need to. Lily was a slower equation. Ruth had taken her to 2 different doctors before Daniel died when the silence first came on, and both had said variations of the same thing. Sometimes children shut down after something terrible, and the only thing you could do was wait and not push and make sure they felt safe enough to come back on their own. One doctor had said it might take weeks. The other had said it might take years. 11 weeks since Daniel's death. Not a word. She wasn't entirely absent. That was the thing. She responded to her name. She ate when food was put in front of her. She followed Ruth up to bed at night and came down in the morning. She would sometimes take Ruth's hand or press herself against her side the way she had that first evening in the kitchen. But she was living behind something, some interior wall she'd built to keep herself from whatever she'd seen the day Daniel died, and Ruth couldn't find a way through it. She hadn't been there. That was the part Ruth couldn't fix in her own mind. She had been at the general store in town, an hour's ride, and Caleb had been with her, and it had been Thomas and Lily at home when the accident happened. Daniel coming off the roof where he'd been patching a leak, the ladder shifting, the fall that shouldn't have killed him but did because of the angle in the frozen ground. Thomas had gone for help. He'd run a half-mile to the nearest neighbor, which was the right thing, the practical thing, the thing that maybe could have made a difference if Daniel had been closer to alive when they got back. Lily had stayed. 6 years old, and she'd stayed beside her father for 2 hours until the neighbors came. And nobody knew exactly what that had looked like from her side of it, because she'd never said a word since. What Ruth understood in the way she understood things that couldn't be explained outright was that her daughter was not going to come back to the world until the world gave her a reason to trust it again. She didn't know if this place could do that. She didn't know if anything could. But she watched. On the 12th day at the ranch, she saw Lily sit down in the barn doorway while Ashford was mending harness. Just sit there in the straw with her knees pulled up, watching his hands. He didn't acknowledge her directly, didn't say her name or make any sudden moves or do any of the things that adults tended to do around damaged children, the over-careful gestures that somehow always made things worse. He just kept working, and after a while he started talking, not to her exactly, more like thinking out loud, explaining what he was doing with the leather and the stitching, why this particular knot held better in cold weather than the other kind, how you could tell when a piece of harness was about to fail before it actually did. Lily sat there for 40 minutes. When she left, she walked back toward the house with something slightly different in the set of her shoulders. Ruth, watching from the kitchen window, couldn't have said exactly what had changed, but something had. They'd been at the ranch for 3 weeks when the letter arrived. A writer came up from the valley, one of the boys from the post office in Caldwell Crossing, who made the mountain run twice a month when the road was passable. He had 3 letters for Ashford, which was apparently not unusual, and 1 for Ruth. She knew before she opened it. The handwriting on the envelope was precise and slightly left-leaning, the letters formed with the care of a man who'd been educated beyond most of the people around him and wanted you to know it. Silas Mercer. She hadn't seen her brother-in-law since Daniel's funeral, where he'd been present in his good coat and his careful condolences and his particular way of looking at things that told you he was already calculating their value. Daniel had 2 older brothers, both of them gone from the territory, and Silas, the youngest, who had stayed close to home and built himself into a man of some local consequence, a moneylender, an investor in various enterprises, a person who knew which officials to cultivate and which laws to bend. Daniel had talked about him with a specific kind of caution, the way you talk about something that could help you or hurt you, depending on the day. She opened the letter at the kitchen table while Ashford was outside and the children were occupied. It was politely worded. That was the first thing, and it was the thing that made her hands cold, because Silas's politeness was always a signal, like the pleasant weather that comes directly before a serious storm. He expressed his concern for her welfare and that of his late brother's children. He noted that he had learned of her current situation and was troubled by it. He wished to discuss arrangements, proper arrangements, he wrote, family arrangements, for the children's care and education, and for the resolution of any outstanding matters relating to Daniel's estate. He would be coming to Caldwell Crossing in mid-December. He hoped she would make herself available. Ruth folded the letter and sat with it for a long moment. She knew what family arrangements meant. She'd known it was coming since the moment the county had sent the ordinance paper, since before that, since the moment at Daniel's grave when Silas had squeezed her hand and said, in his careful voice, that she must not worry, that family took care of its own. At the time, she'd thought it was grief talking. By the time the bank man had come with his gray coat and his numbers, she'd understood it differently. Silas had called it the debts. He'd pressured the creditors. Maybe the county ordinance had been his idea too. She couldn't prove that, but she'd spent enough time thinking about it that it had moved from suspicion to something closer to certainty. He wanted the children. Specifically, she thought, he wanted Caleb and Thomas, who were old enough to work, and he wanted whatever portion of Daniel's estate could be leveraged or claimed once the widow was no longer the primary legal guardian. He was Daniel's blood kin. In this territory, that meant something in the courts, especially with a judge who owed Silas money or favors, or both. She was still sitting there when Ashford came in from the yard. He stopped when he saw her face, the way he'd developed a habit of reading a room before he entered it fully. "Bad news," he said. Not a question. She held up the letter. He came to the table and she watched him read it, his expression not changing much except for a slight tightening around the eyes. He put it down. "You knew he'd come." "I knew," she said. "I just didn't know how long I had." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was not something he usually did in the middle of the day. It meant he was treating this as something that required deliberate attention, and she was both grateful for that and frightened by what it implied. "Tell me about him," he said. So she did. She told him about Silas's business dealings, the lending operation with its convenient terms that somehow always ended with the borrower owing more than they'd started with, the investment partnerships where Silas's share grew regardless of how the business fared. She told him about the two men in Caldwell Crossing who'd lost their farms to Silas's claims over the last 4 years, and the family in the Eastern Valley who'd left the territory entirely rather than fight him in court, and Daniel's quietly expressed worry in the last year of his life that some of their debt had ended up in Silas's hands without his fully understanding how. Ashford listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He'll claim the children," he said. "He'll try." "Does he know where you are?" "He'll find out. He has people in Caldwell Crossing, the man at the post office, possibly the sheriff." She paused. "There's not much that happens in this county that Silas doesn't know about, one way or another." Or Ashford looked at the letter on the table. Then he looked at her, and what was in his face was harder to read than usual. A kind of calculation, but not a cold one. "I want to propose something," he said, "and I want you to know that if you say no, it doesn't change anything about this arrangement. You and the children stay either way. But I think you should hear it." Ruth folded her hands on the table. "All right. In this territory, a married woman's children can't be claimed by an outside party without her consent and her husband's consent, both. A widow's children are," he paused, choosing words carefully, "more vulnerable. The law gives preference to bloodkin in custody disputes, especially male bloodkin, and a judge who wants to find in Silas's favor has room to do that." "I know," Ruth said. "If you were married," Ashford said, "the situation changes. He'd have to go through both of us. That's harder for him in court, and men like him, they don't like hard. They like easy. They look for the easiest way to get what they want, and if you close off the easy way, sometimes they go look for something else." Ruth looked at him across the table. The wood stove was ticking behind her, the sound it made when the metal was hot and expanding, and from upstairs she could hear Thomas moving around, the thump of small feet on old boards. "You're proposing marriage," she said. "A legal arrangement," he said, "for protection. What it becomes after that—" He stopped. "That's not something I can plan for or promise. And I'm not asking you to promise anything either. I'm asking if you're willing to try." She should have needed more time to think about it. She'd spent her whole adult life making decisions carefully, working through the angles, waiting to be sure. But she was tired of waiting to be sure. and the letter on the table was from a man who did not give other people time to be sure, because that was how he'd built his advantages. "You'd be taking on his anger," she said. "He's not a man who forgives obstacles." "I'm aware of that. He has money. He has connections. He could make your life very difficult." "I know what he could do," Ashford said. There was no bravado in it. He sounded like a man who had thought this through already and arrived at an answer. "I've got my own set of complications in this territory. I'm not afraid of men who rely on other men to do their fighting." Ruth looked at the letter one more time. Then she looked at him. "All right," she said. He nodded. "I'll ride down to Caldwell Crossing at the end of the week. There's a magistrate. There's also a new preacher if you want the other kind." "Magistrate's fine," he said, and stood up. "Unless you have a preference." "Magistrate is fine," she said. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair and went back outside. Ruth sat at the table alone for a few minutes, listening to the house, which was full of small sounds. The stove, the children, the wind along the eaves. Then she got up and went back to what she'd been doing before the letter came, because the potatoes weren't going to peel themselves, and whatever was coming, supper still had to happen. She told the children that evening, Caleb first, privately, before the younger two. She'd learned with him that presenting things as done, without softening or excessive explanation, went over better than building up to them. "He's proposing a legal arrangement," she said, "for protection from Silas. It gives the children better standing." Caleb was sitting on the edge of the bed in the upstairs room, and he was very still for a moment. "And that's all it is," he said. Not a question exactly. "That's what it starts as," Ruth said. "I don't know what else it might become." He was quiet. Then, "He's not my father." "No," she said. "He's not. He's not Thomas's either. Or Lily's." "That's true." Another silence. "But you trust him enough to do this." She thought about it honestly. "I trust him enough to try it," she said. "That's not the same thing, and I won't pretend it is." Caleb looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "He works hard," he said. It seemed to be a concession of some kind, something he'd been holding and had decided to put down. "He does," Ruth agreed. "He doesn't hit the horses." "No, he doesn't," Caleb exhaled. "I'm not going to stop watching him." "I wouldn't ask you to." He nodded once. That was the end of the conversation. He got up and went downstairs, and Ruth sat in the upstairs room for a moment before following. Thomas took the news with the same internal intensity he brought to everything, chewing on it for a while before he said, "So he'd be like not a papa, but something like an uncle maybe," Ruth offered, "or just someone who's helping us." Thomas thought about it. "Does that mean I can ask him more questions about the horses?" Despite everything, Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. "I think that's probably fine." Lily, sitting beside Ruth on the bed with her knees pulled up, had heard all of this. She hadn't reacted visibly, but she hadn't retreated either. She was looking at the small oil lamp on the table across the room, its flame steady in the still air. Then, very quietly, so quietly that Ruth almost missed it, Lily spoke. She said, "Is he going to stay?" Ruth went absolutely still. Her heart was doing something large and sudden behind her ribs. She forced herself not to make a noise or a gesture, not to reach out or respond in any way that might startle the girl back into silence. "I think so," Ruth said, keeping her voice even. "I think that's what he intends." Lily looked at the lamp flame for another moment. Then she leaned her head against Ruth's shoulder and stayed there. Ruth sat completely still and didn't breathe properly for a long time. Thomas, from the doorway, had heard. His eyes were wide and wet at the edges. Ruth looked at him and shook her head slightly, and he pressed his lips together and nodded, understanding, and didn't say a word. The magistrate came to the ranch rather than the other way around, because the road to Caldwell Crossing had gotten worse in the days between the proposal and the ceremony, and because Ashford seemed to have a decent relationship with the old man, or at least a functional one, which in this territory served the same purpose. The magistrate was named Harold Fitch, and he was a compact, white-haired man of about 60 who arrived bundled in more coats than seemed technically necessary and conducted the business with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times that it required no ceremony from him. The ceremony itself took about 10 minutes. Ruth wore her best dress, which was not especially good but was clean and pressed, and Ashford had shaved, which she noticed because he didn't usually. Caleb stood to the left of Ruth, looking at something in the middle distance. Thomas stood to Caleb's left, looking at everything. Lily stood beside Ruth and held her hand. When it was done and Harold Fitch had signed the paper and Ashford had signed it and Ruth had signed it, Harold shook their hands and accepted a cup of coffee and told them there'd be a hard freeze by the weekend, which there was, and then he rode back down the mountain. Ruth and Ashford stood in the main room after the children had gone upstairs. The paper was on the table. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You don't have to thank me." "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He picked up his coat. "I'll check the horses before dark." She nodded, and he went out, and she stood in the room alone for a moment and thought about what she'd just done, and didn't entirely know what to make of it, and then went to start supper because the day continued regardless of what you made of it. Word reached Silas Mercer by the second week of December. Ruth didn't know exactly how or through whom, but she knew it had reached him because of what happened next. The first sign was a man named Cord, who appeared at the bottom of the ridge road one morning, just sitting his horse in the tree line, visible from the house. He didn't come up. He just sat there for an hour and then left. Ashford watched him from the porch without saying anything, and that evening he cleaned his rifle, which had been hanging on pegs above the mantel since they'd arrived, and put it on the lower pegs instead. Ruth saw him do this. She didn't comment on it, but she understood what it meant. The second sign came in a letter, this one addressed to both of them, the handwriting on the envelope precise and left-leaning. Inside, Silas expressed his considerable surprise at the news of her marriage. He was sure there had been a misunderstanding of some kind. He was confident that a woman in her position, acting under duress, in an unfamiliar environment, with 3 traumatized children, could not have fully understood what she was doing. He intended to discuss the matter with certain parties who had an interest in ensuring proper family arrangements. He remained, as always, her devoted brother by marriage. Ashford read the letter twice and put it face down on the table. "He's going to challenge the marriage," he said. "He's going to try," Ruth said. "We need to keep the paper somewhere safe. The magistrate's copy is in the county records, but if Silas has friends in the clerk's office, he does. Then we need witnesses who will testify, people he can't get to." Ruth thought about this. "There's the Haggerty women in town. They don't like him. He took money from the older one's husband and made life very unpleasant about the repayment. And there's Pete Sunderland at the feed store. Silas tried to buy his building out from under him last spring." "People with reasons?" Ashford said. "People with reasons," she agreed. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something he did when he was working through a problem. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, and the quality of his voice shifted enough that she paid attention. "I have my own history with men like Silas. Not him specifically, but the kind. There was a man in the county south of here about 4 years back who had a similar way of operating, buying up debt, manipulating legal proceedings. I got into a dispute with him over water rights." He paused. It didn't end quietly. Ruth waited. "I'm telling you because Silas will find out about it, if he hasn't already. He'll use it. He'll try to build a picture of me as a man with a violent history, an unstable man who's influenced you or coerced you or worse." He was looking at her directly now. "I want you to know the shape of it before you hear it from someone who's going to make it sound different than it is. What happened with the water rights dispute? 2 of his men came to the ranch to make a point. They made a mess of my fence line and shot one of my horses." His jaw was set. "I went to them instead of waiting. There was a fight. One of them broke his arm. Nobody died, but it was close enough to close that the county sheriff was involved, and the man filed a complaint, and I have a record of the incident in the county courthouse." Ruth absorbed this. "Did you start the fight?" "No." "Did you do more than you had to?" He considered this honestly, which she appreciated. "Probably a little more than I had to," he said. "I was angry. I'm not good at stopping when I'm angry." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "That's all?" "I asked the questions I needed to ask," she said. "You answered them honestly. That's what I can work with." She folded her hands on the table. "Silas is going to paint whatever picture serves him. If it wasn't the water rights, it would be something else. Men like him are creative. Ashford was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He seemed to think about whether to answer. Someone more... He stopped, tried again. I thought you'd need more steadying than you do. Ruth looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile. I've been steadying myself for 11 weeks, she said. I got some practice in. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it didn't quite become one. He stood up and picked up the letters, both of them, the old one and the new, and folded them together. I'll put these in the strongbox, he said, and I'll ride out to talk to Sunderland this week, if the road holds. Take Caleb with you, Ruth said. Ashford stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking at her. He needs something useful to do, she said, and it'll be good for him to understand what's happening rather than just feeling it. A pause. He's 14. I know how old he is, Ruth said. He's also going to be 15 in March, and he's been carrying a grown man's amount of worry since October, and it's better for him to have real information than to be protected from it and imagine something worse. Ashford seemed to consider this carefully. All right, he said, I'll take him. He went upstairs to put the letters away, and Ruth sat at the table in the quiet of the house. The kind of quiet that had snow in it and cold, and the sound of the wind doing its work against the walls. Outside, the mountains stood where they always stood, indifferent to everything that happened at their feet, storm and calm and storm again. The ranch sat in the valley below them, a small concentration of human effort against all that indifference. And inside the house, a lamp burned on the table, pushing back the dark by exactly as much as a lamp could push. It was enough. For now, it was enough. What was gathering itself on the other side of the winter, down in the valley, in the offices and the money rooms and the careful scheming of Silas Mercer, that would come when it came. Ruth Mercer had learned that you couldn't stop a storm by thinking about it hard enough. You could only make sure that when it hit, you were standing in a place that had been built to hold. She reached over and turned up the lamp, just a little. The barn burned on a Tuesday. Ruth woke to Caleb shaking her shoulder hard enough that her teeth clicked together, and before she was fully conscious, she could already smell it. That particular smell, not the clean smell of a hearth fire, but something darker and more wrong, the smell of things burning that were not meant to burn. She was out of bed and at the window before Caleb said a word, and she could see the orange light moving against the snow, alive and ugly, the barn's silhouette eaten up by it from the inside out. The horses, she said. Ashford's already out there. He got them. I saw him pull them out. They're in the corral. Caleb was dressed, or mostly dressed, his coat on over his nightshirt, his feet in unlaced boots. Thomas is up. Lily's awake. Ruth was already pulling on her coat. Keep them in the house. Mama. Keep them in the house, Caleb. She went down the stairs fast, through the main room and out the front door, into the cold that hit her like a wall after the warmth of the house. The barn was fully engaged. There was nothing to save. That was the first thing she understood, because she'd grown up on a farm, and she knew what a fire looked like when it had a head start. And this one had been going long enough before anyone woke that the roof had already begun to go. Ashford was at the water pump by the side of the house, working it mechanically, which she understood was less about believing he could put it out and more about doing something with his hands. The horses were in the corral, moving in tight nervous circles, their breath coming in white clouds in the cold air. She went to stand beside him. He looked at her once and then back at the fire. I found it at around 2, he said. His voice was flat in the way of someone who is keeping something down. It was already in the roofline by then. I got the horses out. The mules were in the side pen. They're fine. He stopped pumping. The bucket was full. He looked at it. Then he set it down. It was set, he said. Ruth looked at the barn. She could see it now, what her mind had been skirting around since she'd smelled the smoke. There was no natural source in that barn that would have produced this, not at this hour, on a night this cold. The lanterns were always put out. The horses didn't produce enough heat to combust anything. There was no lightning, no stove, nothing. Cord, she said, or someone Silas sent after cord. His jaw was tight. I can't prove it yet. The barn fell in on itself then, the roof giving way with a sound like something exhausted, and the fire went briefly brighter before it began to eat itself down. They stood and watched it. There was nothing else to do. She looked at his hands. The backs of them were reddened. Not badly, but enough. He'd gotten to the horses fast. "Your hands," she said. He looked down at them like he'd forgotten they were there. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." She went back inside and came back with a cloth and the tin of salve she kept in the kitchen, and he stood by the pump and let her work on his hands without arguing, which was not something he did easily. The fire made its sounds behind them. The horses moved in the corral. "He's going to come himself next," Ashford said. "Burning the barn is a message. He wants us scared. He wants us to leave." "We're not leaving," Ruth said. He looked at her. "I know we're not," he said. "I'm just telling you what he's doing." A pause. "I need to send word to some people." "What people?" "Men I've worked with before. Men I trust." He flexed his hands carefully, testing the salve. "There are 3 of them I can reach in the next week if the road's clear. Harlan Briggs, he's a surveyor, but he can handle himself. Owen Fisk, he ranches out east. We've pulled each other out of enough situations that he owes me and knows it. And Walt Creedy." He paused again. "Walt's a former lawman. He left the badge behind for his own reasons. But he knows procedure, and he knows what'll hold up in court." Ruth finished with his hands and stepped back. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since Cord showed up in the tree line," he said. "I just hoped I was wrong about how fast it would move." They stood in the cold and watched the last of the barn come down, the fire settling into a red-orange glow at ground level, hissing where the snow on the edges was close enough to reach it. The sky was starting to go gray at the eastern ridge. It was almost morning. "How long do we have?" Ruth asked. If Silas got word of the marriage in December and the barn is his response, he thought, he'll wait to see if we run, give it a week, maybe 2. Then, if we're still here, he stops waiting. Ruth looked at the ruin of the barn. 7 weeks of work had gone into it, Caleb and Ashford, and 2 days of Thomas carrying smaller things, the winter tack stored inside, the extra feed that would be hard to replace now in the heart of January. "Then we have 2 weeks to get ready," she said. But Harlan Briggs arrived first, 4 days after Ashford sent the letters, riding a spotted horse that was uglier than sin and apparently fast enough to matter, because he made the mountain road in 2 days when it usually took 3. He was a wiry man of about 45 with a permanently squinting expression that made him look suspicious of everything, which Ruth gathered was mostly just the way his face sat. He took off his hat when he came inside, shook Ruth's hand with a businesslike grip, looked at the children with a neutral assessment, and said to Ashford, "You look like hell. Also, I heard you got married." "I did," Ashford said. Briggs looked at Ruth again, this time with something warmer. "Good for you," he said, though it wasn't entirely clear which of them he was addressing. He sat down and accepted coffee and got to business. Owen Fisk came the next day with a pack horse and a young man of about 20 who turned out to be his nephew, and who didn't say much but appeared competent. Fisk was large and deliberate moving, the kind of man who seemed slow until you noticed how little he wasted. He and Ashford had a conversation in the yard before coming in that Ruth didn't try to hear, and when they came inside, Fisk sat across from her and said plainly, "Cole told me the situation. I want you to know that I'm not here because he asked me. I'm here because I don't like men who burn barns." Walt Creedy was the last to arrive and the hardest to read. He was older than the others, maybe 60, with a white mustache and pale eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time in situations that required stillness. He was polite to Ruth in the careful way of a man who'd learned politeness as a professional tool rather than a social one. He spent the first hour he was at the ranch walking the property, which Ruth understood as his own kind of assessment. That evening, with the children upstairs, the 6 of them, Ruth, Ashford, Briggs, Fisk, the nephew, and Creedy, sat at the long table in the main room and talked through what was coming. It was not a comfortable conversation. Walt Creedy laid out the legal situation with the same flat precision he'd probably used at 100 crime scenes, and the legal situation was not good. "Silas Mercer has a relationship with 2 judges in this territory," Creedy said. "One of them is the territorial judge for this district. The other sits in the county to the east. If he files a petition to invalidate the marriage, and he will, it'll land on one of those 2 desks." "Can he invalidate it?" Ruth asked. He can file for it. Whether it holds is a different question, and it's one that depends heavily on what he can demonstrate in court. Creddy looked at her steadily. He'll argue coercion, that you entered into the marriage under duress without full understanding because of your circumstances. He'll paint Cole as someone who exploited a desperate woman. She wasn't coerced, Ashford said. His voice had an edge. I know that. So does everyone in this room. But the judge won't know that unless someone tells him convincingly with evidence. Creddy looked at Ruth. You're the most important witness in this. Your testimony about the circumstances of the marriage, the timeline, what was said, that's the foundation. Everything else supports it. I can testify, Ruth said. I know you can. Something in Creedy's face shifted slightly. Can you do it in front of a room full of people, some of whom may have been put there by Silas to unsettle you, with a judge who's been told to find against you, and hold your account steady for as long as it takes? Ruth looked at him. I've been holding things steady for 11 weeks, she said, in worse situations than a courtroom. Creddy nodded once. Good. They talked for another 2 hours about the physical situation, the ranch's defensible position, the approaches from the valley, the water supply, who had line of sight to what. Briggs had already been looking at the terrain with a surveyor's eye and had opinions. Fisk had opinions about the horse situation, specifically the need to move the remaining horses somewhere less accessible in case of another attack. Ashford listened to all of it and asked specific questions, and when he spoke, it was precise. Ruth listened to all of it too and said less than the men, but missed nothing. At one point, Caleb came downstairs for water, and instead of sending him back up, Ruth let him stay. He sat at the edge of the table and listened, and nobody asked him to leave. When Creddy outlined what Silas's men might do in advance of a direct confrontation, another harassing action, an attempt to cut off supply lines or intimidate neighboring ranches, Caleb said quietly, he'll try to isolate us first. That's what he does. He did it to the Harmon family in the valley, cut off their ability to get goods in until they gave up. Everyone looked at him. I listened, Caleb said with a slight defensiveness, when adults talked about him. Before. Creddy looked at the boy for a moment with those pale eyes. That's a reasonable read, he said. He probably will try that. Then he went on, and Caleb stayed at the table, and nobody made anything of it. Later, after the men had settled in their places, Briggs and Creddy in the main room, Fisk and his nephew in the repaired corner of the barn foundation that was the best they could do now, Ruth stood by the front window for a while, looking out at the dark. Ashford came and stood beside her. They'd been doing this more lately, standing in proximity to each other without quite knowing what to call it, the way two people do when circumstances have pressed them together and they've discovered they don't mind the proximity as much as they expected. Are you afraid? He asked. Yes, she said without hesitation, because she was done performing calm she didn't have. Are you? He thought about it in the way he thought about most things, not reflexively, but with an actual pause. I'm worried about the children, he said. That's the part that... He stopped. I've been in bad situations before, and I could handle that because it was just me, and it didn't matter as much. This is different. Ruth looked at him. She knew what he was saying, even though he hadn't quite said it. She let it be what it was without naming it, because sometimes naming things too early broke them. They're resilient, she said, more than I wish they had to be. Lily spoke again today, he said. Did you know that? Ruth turned to him. What did she say? She was in the yard when I was moving the horses. She came up beside me and she said... He stopped again, and she could see it cost him something, the way certain things always did when they landed where he wasn't defended. She said, the gray one is my favorite, about the gray mare. Ruth didn't say anything. That's all, he said. Just that. That's not just anything, Ruth said. He looked out the window. No, he said. I suppose it's not. Silas came on a Thursday morning in late January when the snow was hard and crusted, and the sky was a thin, clear blue that made everything look sharp-edged and exposed. He came with 7 men, which was more than Ruth had expected, and apparently more than Ashford had too, because she saw him register the number from the front window and recalibrate something behind his eyes. She had put the children in the back room upstairs, the one with one small window that faced the rock formation, away from the yard. She had told Caleb to stay there and not to come down regardless of what he heard. She had told Thomas the same thing. She had told Lily, who had looked at her with that deep, steady look, the one that saw more than a 6-year-old should be able to see. "Will you come back?" Lily had asked. "Yes," Ruth had said. She hadn't let herself think about the fact that she couldn't fully guarantee that. "Yes, I'll come back." Lily had taken Ruth's hand and held it for a moment. Then she'd let go. Silas Mercer had not changed much in the months since the funeral. He was a composed man in his mid-40s, thicker than Daniel had been, with Daniel's features rearranged into something harder and more deliberate. He dressed well, even here, even on horseback. A dark wool coat, good boots. He sat his horse in the yard of the ranch like a man arriving at a property inspection, which Ruth supposed was exactly how he thought of it. She went out onto the porch. She had not planned to let Ashford be the first face Silas saw, because this was her fight. In a way, it hadn't started as his, and she wanted Silas to see that she understood that. "Ruth," Silas said. He sounded almost gentle, which was his most dangerous register. "You look well, considering." "Considering what?" she said. He spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a man explaining something obvious. "The circumstances, the situation you've been placed in." His eyes moved over the house, over her, and then to the men who were positioned, not obviously, but present, at various points around the yard. Briggs by the woodshed, Fisk at the corner of the house, Creedy somewhere behind her that Silas couldn't see. "I see you have company." "I have friends," she said. "It's not the same thing." Ashford came out the door behind her and stood to her left, slightly back, which was where she'd asked him to position himself. She felt his presence there the way you feel a wall at your back. Silas looked at him with the expression of a man examining something he finds distasteful. "Cole Ashford," he said. "I've heard a great deal about you." "I know you have," Ashford said. "I've heard a great deal about you too." This, Silas gestured at the space between them, arrangement. "I think you both understand that it won't stand. A woman in Ruth's position, vulnerable, grieving, manipulated into a hasty legal action." "Nobody manipulated me," Ruth said. "Ruth." He said her name with patient firmness, the tone of a man who has decided in advance not to hear certain things. "You had no real choice. You were in debt, homeless, your children were at risk. A man with resources offered you a way out and you took it, because what else could you do? That's not a marriage. That's coercion wearing a magistrate's paper." "I proposed it," Ashford said. "Of course you did." Silas's voice had not changed. "And I'm sure you had very good reasons." "I had reasons," Ashford said. "The main one was that it was the right thing." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "I have papers," he said, and nodded to one of the men behind him who produced a document. "A court order signed by Judge Haverling in the Eastern County, directing that the children of my late brother Daniel Mercer be placed in my custody pending a review of the validity of this marriage." Ruth felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face even. "Judge Haverling is 300 miles away," Creedy said from behind her. He'd come out to the porch quietly, the way he did everything. "His jurisdiction over a property dispute in this county is questionable at minimum, and that document will be challenged." Silas looked at Creedy with the quick assessment of a man who has just recalculated something. He hadn't expected a former lawman. "Walt Creedy," Creedy said, because introduction seemed useful. "Formerly with the Territorial Marshal's Office. I'm here in an advisory capacity." He looked at the document in the hand of Silas's man. "I'll be happy to take a copy of that back to Caldwell Crossing for filing with the county clerk, who will forward it to the appropriate court. That's the legal process. Would you like to follow it?" Something moved behind Silas's eyes. The calculation his face didn't show was happening behind it. "I've come a long way," he said. He let it sit there, which was a particular technique of his, the implication left to become whatever the other person was most afraid of. "You're welcome to turn around," Ashford said. The men behind Silas shifted slightly. Ruth watched them. Most of them were hired. She could tell from the way they held themselves, the mix of professional alertness and personal disinterest that men had when they were doing a job rather than fighting for a cause. But two of them, on the left side, were different. They had a particular intentness that the others didn't, a willingness in the body. She noted which two. Silas looked at Ruth for a long moment. She held his gaze. She had practiced this, not consciously, but by necessity. By 11 weeks of holding things together that didn't want to be held. She could hold a gaze. "I'll be back," he said finally. "With the proper authorities." "We'll be here," Ruth said. He held for another beat, checking whether she'd flinch. She didn't. He turned his horse, and the men followed, and they rode back down the ridge road the way they came, and Ruth watched them go until the tree line took them. Behind her, Ashford let out a slow breath. She could hear it. "That wasn't the end," Grady said quietly. "No," Ruth said. "He was counting things. The men, the positions. He'll come back with a better number." "How long?" "Days," she said. "Not long. He's not patient when he's been refused." She was right. They came 4 days later before first light, and they came with more men than Silas had brought the first time. 12, maybe 14. It was hard to count in the dark. Ruth counted muzzle flashes later and came to 13. But she hadn't been at the window for all of it. The first shot came from the tree line on the east side, and it hit the wall of the house 2 feet from where Caleb was supposed to be sleeping, except he wasn't there because he'd come downstairs in the night for water and had fallen asleep in the chair by the wood stove, which was the thing that, later, she couldn't stop thinking about. The randomness of it, the inch and the minute, and Ashford and Briggs were out the back door before the echo of the first shot died. Fisk and his nephew were already at positions they'd identified 4 days ago when this was still a plan. Creddy went to the front window and took up a spot that gave him a line on the approach from the road. Ruth took the children to the back of the house, the interior wall, and put them down below the window line. Thomas was white-faced and shaking, but not crying. Lily was pressed against Ruth's side, her eyes wide and dark. Caleb was not with them. "Where's Caleb?" Ruth said, and the fear in her voice was not controlled. "He went—" Thomas pointed toward the front of the house. Ruth put Lily's hand in Thomas's. "Stay here, below the windows, don't move." She went through the house fast, low, the way Creddy had showed them. The shooting was sporadic, not sustained, not an organized volley, which meant Silas's men were taking individual shots, trying to force everyone inside rather than hold a perimeter, which meant they were going to try to rush the house at some point. She found Caleb at the front window beside Creddy. He had Ashford's spare rifle in his hands. "Caleb," she said. "I can shoot," he said. He didn't look at her. His eyes were on the yard where 2 of Silas's men had gotten close enough that she could see them in the pre-dawn gray. "Papa taught me. I'm a good shot." "Caleb, come away from—" "Mama." He turned to look at her then, and what was in his face was not anger or bravado or the recklessness of a boy who didn't understand what he was doing. It was something she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror for 11 weeks, a person who understood exactly what the situation was and had decided what they were going to do about it. "I'm not going to watch from upstairs." Creddy, without looking away from his own position, said, "He's got a good eye. I've been watching him the last few days." Ruth stood in the dark of her own house with a war happening on the other side of the walls, and she looked at her 14-year-old son, and she felt all of it at once, the terror of it, the grief of it, and underneath both something that was not quite pride because pride was too simple a word. "Stay low," she said. "Don't fire unless Creddy tells you." She went back to Lily and Thomas. The shooting went on for what felt like an hour and was probably 20 minutes. There were exchanges. Briggs and Fisk and Ashford outside, Creddy at the window, and then a stretch of near silence that was worse than the noise, and then voices. And Ruth pressed herself against the interior wall and listened to the voices without being able to make out words. Then she heard a sound that was different from all the others. A door. Not hers, not the front, the back. She moved before she'd decided to, putting herself between the back door and the children, because that was the calculation that happened without thought. The door opened, and it was Ashford, and for a second everything in her body that had been braced released so hard she had to put a hand on the wall. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. He had blood on his face. Not his, she thought, or at least not mainly his. And his coat was torn at the shoulder. "They've pushed back into the tree line. Silas is out there. He pulled most of his men back when Briggs got the one on the east flank. But they haven't gone." "Are you hurt?" "Enough," he said. "Not bad." He looked at the children, at Thomas, at Lily, then he looked past Ruth toward the front of the house. "Where's Caleb?" "Front window," she said. Something moved across his face. He went through the house. Ruth heard him at the front. A low exchange. Crady's voice, then Ashford's, then Caleb's, too quiet to make out, then more silence, then a single shot from inside the house, then shouting. Ruth was at the front in 3 steps. Caleb was at the window, the rifle still raised, and in the gray yard below she could see a figure down. Not dead, she thought, because of the way the figure was moving, but down. And the other figures were scattering, pulling back, losing the formation that had been advancing on the house. Caleb lowered the rifle. His hands were not entirely steady. "He had coal in his sights," Caleb said. His voice was thin and strange, the voice of someone not quite inside their own body. "He was right there. I could see where he was pointing. He stopped. Ashford came and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Caleb flinched and then went very still. "You did right," Ashford said. His voice was as level as Ruth had ever heard it, which she understood was a choice he was making. "You hear me? You did right." Caleb's jaw was working. He was 14. He just shot a grown man. These 2 facts sat in the room with all of them, and nobody knew exactly what to do with them. "Is he—" Caleb started. "He's down," Critty said from his position. "He's moving. You didn't kill him." He glanced at the boy. "You hit his shoulder. Good shot, actually." Caleb put the rifle down on the table beside the window. He put it down very carefully, the way you put down something that has become different from what it was when you picked it up. From outside, the sound of horses, Silas's men pulling back, the retreat becoming less organized, a shout in the distance that sounded like an order being given in desperation rather than command. And then, from farther away, from down the ridge road, another sound, more horses. A different sound, controlled, deliberate, the rhythm of official movement. Cretty looked out the window and stood slightly straighter. "Company," he said. "Who?" Ashford asked. A pause. "Territorial marshal, 2 deputies, and—" Another pause. And someone I recognize. Judge Fallow, from the Northern Circuit." His voice carried something in it that hadn't been there before. "The right judge." Ruth stood in the middle of the room with all of it around her. The broken glass on the floor, the smoke smell, Ashford's torn coat, Caleb standing over the rifle he'd put down, Cretty at the window. From the back of the house, she heard Thomas's voice, probably asking something because Thomas always asked things, and then Lily's voice, quieter, 2 syllables she couldn't make out. Lily was talking. Even now, in this, Lily was talking. Ruth pressed her hand flat against the wall to steady herself. Whatever Silas had thought he was building with his money and his judges and his hired men, whatever architecture of control he'd constructed over years of patient, calculated acquisition, it had cracked. Right here, in a house he'd come to take that had held against him. The marshal and his men were in the yard. Silas was somewhere in the trees, and he had a wounded man, and he had a set of orders from a judge 300 miles away that were about to encounter a different judge far closer to home. Outside, the sun was finally making it over the ridge. It hit the snow in the yard, and the crushed surface of it threw the light back, sharp and clean and without mercy, illuminating everything exactly as it was. The marshal's name was Hector Dade, and he was not a man who wasted time on pleasantries when there was work to do. He came through the yard with the particular efficiency of someone who had seen enough frontier violence to stop being surprised by it, but had not become indifferent to it either. A distinction Ruth noticed immediately, because indifference and efficiency looked similar from a distance and were entirely different up close. He was maybe 50, with a broad face and a gray-streaked mustache and the kind of eyes that moved constantly without seeming to, cataloging everything in a room or a yard without making a production of it. His first action upon arriving was to send his 2 deputies into the tree line after Silas's retreating men. His second was to look at the house, the bullet-pocked front wall, the broken window glass on the porch boards, the boot-churned snow in the yard, and say, to no one in particular, when did it start? "Before first light," Ashford said. He'd come out to the porch, the torn shoulder of his coat held together with his left hand. "Around 4. "How many of them?" 13, give or take. Some pulled back early when we held the east flank. 6 or 7 were still in position when you came down the road. Dade looked at him. "You're Ashford." "I am. Walt Creedy told me about you, said you'd need help before spring." Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted. He was right about the timing. Behind Dade, the judge had dismounted. Judge Fallow was a spare, angular man of about 60, who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees had been giving him trouble for years, but who had decided not to mention it. He wore a plain, dark coat and carried a leather satchel that looked older than most of the buildings in the territory. He was not impressive in the way that powerful men often performed being impressive. He just looked like someone who had decided a long time ago what his job was and had been doing it without drama ever since. Creddy came out and shook the judge's hand, and Ruth watched the two men in conversation and understood from the quality of it, the quick shorthand, the absence of explanation, that they had a long history. "Mrs. Ashford," the judge said when Creedy brought him over. He used the name without ceremony, which was the right thing, and she felt the rightness of it even in the middle of everything else. "Judge Fallow," she said, "Walt has given me a considerable amount of information about your situation over the past 2 weeks. I've also received, through the proper channels, a petition from a man named Silas Mercer seeking to challenge your marriage and claim custody of your late husband's children." He paused. "I found the petition interesting in several respects, not least of which was the speed with which it moved through Judge Haverling's court." "Silas has connections in that court," Ruth said. "He did," Fallow said, with a slight emphasis on the tense. "Judge Haverling is currently under review by the Territorial Oversight Committee for irregularities in 3 separate cases over the last 2 years. That review began approximately 10 days ago." He let that land. "So the order that Mr. Mercer was carrying when he came to this property has, shall we say, a compromised provenance." Ruth looked at Creedy. Creedy was looking at the mountain line with an expression of studied neutrality that didn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. "You did that," she said to him. "I filed a report," he said, "based on information I gathered before I came up here. The committee did the rest." She didn't say anything for a moment. There were things she wanted to say that she didn't have words for yet, so she let them wait. Dade's deputies came back from the tree line with 4 of Silas's men, hands bound, walking ahead of the horses. Silas was among them. She could see that from the porch. He was walking, so he hadn't been hurt, though she noted he was not wearing his good coat anymore, which meant something unplanned had happened to it during the retreat. His face, when he came into the yard, was contained. It was the face he used when things had gone wrong, and he was already deciding how to reframe them. He looked at Ruth on the porch, and his eyes did not change. "Ruth," he said, and his voice still had the gentleness in it, the patient register. "This is going to be resolved properly. I want you to know that." "It is," she agreed. He looked at Judge Fallow, something recalculated behind his eyes. "Judge, I don't know what you've been told about this situation, but I can assure you that my actions have been motivated entirely by concern for my brother's family, and I have documentation." "Tu must, Mr. Mercer," Fallow said mildly. "I have a great deal of documentation as well. I suggest we conduct this conversation in an appropriate setting." He looked at Dade. "The county courthouse in Caldwell Crossing, I think, rather than a ranch yard." Dade nodded and said something to his deputies, and the practical business of securing and transporting Silas and his men began. Ruth watched it happen from the porch, with her arms folded against the cold. At one point, Silas turned and looked at her again. One long, measuring look, the kind that was meant to communicate something about the future, about his continued intention. She met it and didn't look away until he was moved along by the deputy's hand on his arm. When they took him down the road and around the first bend and out of sight, Ruth stood on the porch alone for a moment and breathed. Then she went inside to find the children. Toss. Caleb was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he was too young for, and the look of someone who had gone a long way inside himself and was slowly making the journey back. Thomas had fallen asleep against the wall in the back room, still in his coat, the wooden horse clutched in both hands. Lily was sitting on the floor beside Thomas, awake, watching the window. Ruth sat down across from Caleb and didn't say anything immediately because she'd learned with him that the first words after a hard thing mattered more than the words that came after. "He was going to shoot Cole," Caleb said. He said it the way he'd said it in the front room, but slower now, like he was testing the words to see if they still felt true. "I saw where the gun was pointed. I had about 2 seconds." "I know," Ruth said. "I keep thinking about whether I could have done something different." He looked at his hands around the cup. yelled or moved or something that wasn't. There wasn't, Ruth said. You don't know that. No, she said. I don't know it for certain, but I know that 2 seconds is not enough time for most of the options you're thinking of. And I know that you made a decision and it was the right one, and the man is alive, so whatever you're carrying about it is real, but it doesn't need to weigh as much as it does right now. Caleb looked at her. Ashford is not my father, he said. It was the same thing he'd said weeks ago in the upstairs room, but the meaning of it had shifted. But I didn't want him to die. I know, Ruth said. Is that... He stopped. Tried again. Is it strange that I... No, she said. It's not strange. He nodded and looked back at his coffee and didn't say anything else. And she understood that the conversation was done. Not because there wasn't more to say, but because he needed time to let what had been said settle before he could hold more. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his, the way she had when he was small and had hurt himself, and she was acknowledging it without making it bigger. He didn't pull away. Thus, Ashford's shoulder needed actual attention, which Ruth made him sit still for that afternoon while the yard quieted and the Marshals group moved on and Briggs and Fisk settled into the relieved, slightly aimless state of men who had been wound tight for days and could finally release. Fisk's nephew turned out to know something about carpentry and immediately began an assessment of what it would take to rebuild the barn, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. The wound was a graze. She'd been right in her first assessment, looking at him on the porch in the dark. The bullet had caught the outer edge of his shoulder, tearing the coat and the skin beneath, but not going deep. It needed cleaning and it needed closing, and she had what she needed for both, though the cleaning was going to hurt, and she told him so. I've had worse, he said. That's not the same as it not hurting, she said, and began. He was quiet through most of it, which was his way, but she could read the tension in his jaw and the set of his breathing, the small physical vocabulary that told you what a person was feeling when they weren't saying. When she was putting the second suture in, she'd learned this particular skill from a neighbor woman who'd been a midwife and believed everyone should know how to close a wound. He said, without changing his expression, "You're good at this." "I've had practice," she said. "Hold still." "Where'd you learn to suture?" Woman named Agatha Moss. She helped birth half the children in our valley, and she said a person who couldn't stitch skin was only half prepared for frontier life. Smart woman. She was. Ruth tied off the second suture and started on the third. She also said the worst patients were men, because they either didn't tell you when something was wrong or they made too much of it. A pause. "Which kind am I?" "The first," she said. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but close. "Ashford," she said, not looking up from the wound. "Cole," he said. "We've been married 2 months." She looked up at him then, briefly, and felt the particular awkwardness of the situation. The two of them in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming in at an angle, his shirt pulled down over one shoulder, her hands doing careful work on his skin. There was an intimacy to it that neither of them had been entirely prepared for when this began, and she suspected he felt it too from the slight change in how he was holding himself. "Cole," she said, and the name settled into her mouth more naturally than she expected. "You need to eat something before this closes. You lost blood." "Is that the medical advice or the—" "It's both," she said. "Don't argue with the person holding the suture needle." He was quiet, and when she looked up again he was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, something careful and uncertain and genuine all at once. She looked back down at her work. When she was done and his shoulder was wrapped and he had eaten the food she'd put in front of him, he said, "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," she said, and they both recognized it. The third time one of them had said that to the other, and he smiled. A real one, not the almost laugh, but an actual smile, which she had not seen from him before, and which changed his face significantly. She filed it away. The hearing in Caldwell Crossing was set for the second week of February, which gave Ruth 4 days to prepare. She spent those 4 days doing 2 things simultaneously: managing the practical matters of the ranch, which did not pause for legal proceedings, and building her testimony. Not in the sense of constructing a story. She didn't need to construct anything, because the truth was sufficient, and she knew it. But in the sense of organizing it, of deciding what order to say things in and how to say them clearly, and which details mattered most and how to hold all of it together under pressure. Creddy worked with her on this. They sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were upstairs, and he walked her through the shape of what Silas's attorney would try to do, which was essentially to make her seem confused, grateful, frightened, dependent, a woman who had made a desperate decision that she needed to be rescued from. "He'll ask you how long you'd known Cole before the marriage," Creedy said. "He'll emphasize the short timeline. He'll ask about the auction and try to make it sound like the auction was Cole's leverage rather than a situation he stepped into. Can I explain the context?" "You can try. He'll interrupt. Judge Fallow will let you finish. He's fair about that. But the interruptions are designed to make you lose your thread. So you need your thread to be very simple and very clear." Ruth thought about this. "The simplest thing is that I understood the proposal and I agreed to it of my own will. Everything else is detail." Creddy looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it. Then I'll start there and come back to it if I lose my way." He nodded slowly. "You've done this before," he said. "Not testimony, but this kind of thinking." "I managed a household and 3 children and debts and a sick husband and then a dead husband for about 4 years," she said. "I've been managing things in my head constantly for longer than that. You learn to think in a certain way." "He's going to try to shake you," Creedy said. "He can try," Ruth said. She wasn't being brave about it. She understood that. She was being accurate. She'd been shaken by worse things than a lawyer in a room, and the shaking had not undone her. She went to Caldwell Crossing 2 days before the hearing to talk to the people she needed to talk to. Margaret Haggerty met her at the door of the house on Elm Street with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation and was ready to have it. She sat Ruth down and gave her tea and said, without preamble, "Silas Mercer ruined my husband's business and then had the audacity to come to the funeral. Tell me what you need." Ruth told her. Margaret listened and asked several sharp questions and then said she would testify, and she would bring her sister-in-law, who had her own accounting of Silas's methods that predated Margaret's own by 6 years. Pete Sunderland at the feed store was less openly angry about it, but no less willing. He had records. He'd kept records of everything Silas had done in connection with the building deal. The conversation, the terms, the threat that had followed when Pete refused to sell. He'd kept them in a locked box under the counter because he'd known even then that there might come a day. Ruth went to 3 other people, all of whom said yes, some more readily than others, all of whom had something real to offer. She had not expected to collect 6 willing witnesses in a day and a half. She had hoped for 2 or 3. She rode back up the mountain on the second day in the late afternoon, the cold less biting than it had been, the sky a pale, clear blue that made the snow on the peaks look almost white rather than gray. She thought about Daniel on the ride, which she did sometimes now in a way that was different from the first weeks, less like pressing on a bruise and more like visiting somewhere she'd been and was no longer living. She thought about the fact that he'd worried about Silas in those last months, had said once, late at night when the children were asleep, that he didn't like how close Silas seemed to be getting to their business without quite ever explaining why. She thought about what he would have made of all of this. The auction, the ranch, Cole Ashford, the hearing coming up. She thought he would have been angry about the auction. She thought he would have been relieved about everything that came after, and that the relief would have cost him something to admit, because Daniel had been proud in ways that sometimes made things harder than they needed to be. She thought, riding up the mountain, that she loved him still and always would, and that this was entirely compatible with also being grateful that the day in Caldwell Crossing had ended the way it had. The morning of the hearing, Lily came downstairs early and found Ruth in the kitchen before anyone else was up, already dressed, standing at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. "You're scared," Lily said. Ruth turned. Lily was standing in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair loose, her feet bare on the cold boards. She had been speaking more so, not constantly, not with the easy chattering flow she'd had before, but steadily, words appearing where they were needed. Every one of them still felt like a small gift. "A little," Ruth said. "Are we going to lose?" Ruth thought about being honest and thought about being reassuring and settled on the intersection of the two. "I don't think so," she said. I think we have more on our side than Silas does, but I can't promise you. Lily crossed the kitchen and stood beside Ruth at the window. She was small enough that the window showed her mostly sky. Is Cole coming? Yes. Good, Lily said. She said it with a finality that made Ruth look down at her. Why good? Lily considered this in the way she considered things now, with visible deliberation, as if she were sorting through options before committing to the words. Because when he's there, I feel safer, she said. It's like when Papa used to be there. Not the same, but the same kind of thing. Ruth put her arm around Lily's shoulders and held her. She didn't say anything because the right response to that was silence, or something close to it. After a moment, Lily said, Are my feet cold or is the floor cold? Both, Ruth said. Oh. She stayed another minute anyway, looking out the window at the mountain morning, and then she went back upstairs to get her socks. The courtroom in Caldwell Crossing was not large, but it was full. Ruth had not expected that. She'd thought there might be a handful of observers, the mandatory officials, the attorneys. What she found when she came through the door was that word had moved through the town in the days leading up to the hearing, and the word had brought people out, and the people had filled every seat and were standing along the back wall. She recognized faces. Margaret Haggerty and her sister-in-law in the third row, Pete Sunderland near the window. Several people she knew only by sight, farmers, shopkeepers, a woman from the laundry who had given Ruth work in the hard weeks after Daniel died and had never been anything but fair about the payment. There were also strangers, people she didn't know, which surprised her until she thought about it and understood. Silas Mercer had operated in this county for years, and the people who had suffered from his methods were not only the ones she'd personally sought out. Silas was already present, seated at his attorney's table with the composure he always maintained in public, though she thought she detected something slightly effortful about it today. His attorney was a man named Greer, who had the look of someone imported from somewhere with bigger law offices, well-dressed and precise. Cole was beside her. He'd worn his best coat, which was not exceptionally good, but was clean and pressed, and he'd shaved again, which she'd noticed. He'd offered her his arm at the courthouse door in a slightly formal, slightly uncertain way, as though he wasn't sure of the protocol for the situation, and she'd taken it because she wasn't sure of the protocol either, and at this point they were both navigating by instinct. Caleb was on her other side. She'd asked him if he wanted to come, and he had said yes before she'd finished asking, which told her everything she needed to know about where he was with this. Thomas and Lily were at the ranch with Fisk, which was the right call. They were too young for this specific ordeal, and Lily had accepted the explanation with a seriousness that suggested she understood more than she was letting on. Judge Fallow came in and everyone stood, and the hearing began. Greer was good. Ruth gave him that. He was controlled and methodical, and he came at the key points with a patience that was designed to make her impatient, to make her fill the pauses with things that would be turned against her. He spent 20 minutes on the timeline of the marriage, the auction in November, the marriage in December, the short distance between them, implying without quite stating that the speed itself was evidence of something improper. Ruth answered each question with the thread Creedy had helped her find. She had understood the proposal. She had agreed of her own will. She had made the decision freely in full knowledge of her circumstances. She said it in different words each time, but the core of it was the same, and she did not let the restatements make her doubt the truth of it, because they were techniques, and she knew they were techniques. When Greer tried to characterize the auction as a form of coercion that had placed her entirely in Ashford's power, she said quietly, Mr. Ashford was one person in a situation created by multiple parties, including your client, who I believe had a direct hand in the circumstances that led to that auction. I made a choice from the options I had. That's what adults do. Fallow let her finish. Greer objected to the reference to Silas, and Fallow sustained it, which was fair, but the words had already been said. When it was her turn to make her account, she stood and told the truth. Not the carefully arranged version, not the strategic version, the actual truth, which was that she'd been standing on a platform in the cold with her children, and a man she'd never met had paid $15 and offered them shelter and dignity and the chance to survive the winter. That she'd learned over the following weeks what kind of man he was. That he had made a legal proposal she'd understood completely, and accepted because it was the right thing for her and her children, and because she had come to trust the person making it. She said it plainly, without decoration, and the room was very quiet while she said it. Then she told them about Silas. She told them about the letter, about the man in the tree line, about the court order from a judge, who was currently under review for irregularities. She told them about the barn. She told them about the morning of the attack, and she was precise about the details. The timing, the number of men, the nature of what had happened. She didn't exaggerate and she didn't minimize and she did not let her voice shake, though it wanted to at certain points. When she sat down, the room was still quiet for a moment. Then Fallow called the first witness. Margaret Haggerty testified. She was composed and specific and had dates and amounts and the names of the people involved in the transaction that had harmed her husband's business. She did not appear angry. She appeared certain, which was more effective. Pete Sunderland presented his documentation, which he'd brought in a folder that he handled with the care of something long preserved for exactly this purpose. The dates were precise. The records were clear. 3 more witnesses followed. Each one added a piece, a different transaction, a different method, a different family that had been maneuvered out of what they'd built. The picture that assembled itself in the courtroom was not dramatic. It was patient and deliberate and thorough, the way Silas himself operated, and the irony of that was not lost on Ruth. Silas's attorney objected frequently. Fallow ruled on the objections fairly, sustaining some, overruling others, and the testimony continued. At one point, Greer attempted to introduce the character evidence about Cole that they'd both anticipated, the water rights incident from 4 years ago, and Crady, sitting in the gallery, had prepared an affidavit from the former county sheriff. In that case, that characterized the incident with considerably more context than Silas's version would have provided. Fallow read it. He looked at Greer. Is this the extent of the character evidence? It establishes a pattern. It establishes a single incident, 4 years ago, in which the subject defended his property after a documented act of vandalism and violence against his livestock. Fallow set the affidavit down. I'll note it and move on. At the end of the day, Fallow recessed and returned and sat at the bench and delivered his findings in the flat, precise language of a man who had made up his mind and was now stating it without editorial. The marriage was valid and would stand. The petition for custody was denied. The order from Judge Haverling's court was set aside pending the outcome of the oversight review. Silas Mercer was bound over for trial on charges of arson, criminal intimidation, and conspiracy to commit assault, based on the evidence gathered from the attack on the ranch. He was remanded to the county jail immediately. Ruth watched 2 deputies lead Silas across the courtroom. He passed within 6 feet of her, and he looked at her. He couldn't not look. And for a moment she saw something in his face that wasn't the gentleness or the calculation. Something raw and surprised. The expression of a man who genuinely had not believed this was possible. She didn't look away, but she didn't lean into it either. She just watched him pass. Cole was beside her, and she felt his hand at the small of her back, a light touch that was asking rather than assuming, and she didn't move away from it. In the gallery, Caleb had his arms crossed over his chest and was watching the room with the expression of someone filing things carefully into memory. At one point he caught her looking, and something passed between them, something that didn't have a name yet, that was too new and too complicated for a name, but that was real. Outside afterward, in the cold of the Caldwell Crossing street, people came to speak to her. Not many, and not at length. Most of them had their own days to get back to. But they came. The woman from the laundry, a farmer she only vaguely recognized who said his brother-in-law had lost land to Silas 2 years ago, and today was the first good news about that situation he'd had. Margaret Haggerty, who shook her hand with both of hers and didn't say much because she didn't need to. It took a while. The street was cold and the light was going, and the mountain road home was not getting any shorter, but she stood there and received each person because they had come, and that meant something she hadn't had words for until it was happening. Finally, the street was mostly empty. Creddy was speaking with Fisk near the horses. Briggs had already headed for the saloon, which was both predictable and deserved. Caleb had gotten a stick of candy from somewhere and was eating it with the slightly dazed expression of someone whose nervous system was just beginning to understand that the worst had passed. Cole was beside her. They stood there on the street in the late-day cold, and she looked at the mountains to the north, the ones she'd come to know the shape of over the past months, and she thought about what it meant to be standing in a town she'd been auctioned out of 3 months ago and having people come to shake her hand. "You were extraordinary in there," Cole said. She considered deflecting it and didn't. "I was honest in there," she said. "It turned out that was enough." He looked at the mountains too, and they stood there in the cold together without needing to say anything for a while. It was the kind of silence that was easy in a way that other silences hadn't been, and she noticed the difference. "We should start back," she said finally. "Lily will want to know everything." "Thomas will too," he said, "and he'll have questions. Thomas always has questions. He asked me yesterday how many board feet of lumber it takes to rebuild a barn," Cole said. "I told him I didn't know offhand. He said he'd figure it out." Ruth looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said he could help Fisk's nephew with the measurements and they'd know by dinner." A pause. "He did." She shook her head, not with exasperation, but with something warmer. They walked toward the horses, and Caleb fell in beside them without being called, candy stick in hand, and the three of them went down the street in the late afternoon light, their boots on the cold boards, the mountains ahead and the courthouse behind. The road home climbed north, the way it always did, into the high country where the ranch sat in its valley with the fire laid and the horses in the rebuilt corral and two children waiting to hear what had happened. The air was sharp and clean at this altitude, the kind of air that didn't forgive weakness but didn't hold grudges either. It was simply what it was, and what you did with it was your own business. Ruth Mercer, Ruth Ashford, rode up that road as the last of the daylight left the valley floor, and she did not look back. They came home to a fire already burning. Fisk had laid it before he left with his nephew, banking the coals high enough that the main room was warm when Ruth pushed open the front door, and Thomas came off the settle by the window where he'd clearly been watching the road for the last hour. And he didn't say anything at first, just stood there with his wooden horse in one hand and his face asking everything his mouth hadn't gotten to yet. "We won," Ruth said. Thomas sat back down. Not with relief, with something that looked more like the physical result of tension leaving a body all at once, the way a rope goes slack. He sat down and pressed his mouth together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and Ruth understood that he'd been holding more than she'd realized, and that the holding had been hard. Lily came down the stairs. She'd been upstairs when they arrived, and she came down slowly, one step at a time, in her socks, watching Ruth's face. "Is he gone?" she asked. She didn't say Silas's name. She never had, not since she'd started speaking against it. He was always he, the way certain things get referred to obliquely because naming them gives them too much presence. "He's in the county jail," Ruth said. "He's not coming here again." Lily stood on the third step from the bottom and thought about this with the visible seriousness she brought to everything now. Then she came down the last 3 steps and walked past Ruth and Cole both, and went to Caleb and hugged him around the middle with both arms. Caleb, who had not been hugged by anyone in longer than he'd probably admit, went still for a second and then put his arms around his sister's shoulders and held on. Thomas watched this from the settle and then said, with the tone of someone who has been thinking about a problem and arrived at a solution, "Fisk's nephew said the barn will take 40 days to rebuild if the weather holds." "Did he?" Cole said. "I helped with the measurements." Thomas hesitated. "I might have gotten one wrong. The east wall. I had to do it twice." 41 days then," Cole said. Thomas considered this. "Maybe 42 to be safe." "Then 42 it is." Ruth looked at Cole across the room, over the children's heads, and something passed between them that was mostly tiredness and relief, and something else underneath both that neither of them was quite ready to name, in a room full of children on a night that had already held enough. She went to start supper, because the day continued, and they were all of them hungry. February finished itself out, and March came in with the temperamental fickleness that early spring had in the high country. 3 warm days that made you believe, followed by a hard freeze that reminded you what believing too early cost. The snow came off the south-facing slopes in patches, revealing the brown-gray of the dead grass underneath, and in the mornings the mud was frozen, and by afternoon it was not, which made every trip across the yard a negotiation. The barn went up in stages. Fisk's nephew, whose name turned out to be Marcus, a fact Ruth felt obscurely guilty about not knowing until the 3rd week, came back with 2 men from the valley who knew framing, and Cole and Caleb worked alongside them from first light to the limit of the winter daylight, 6 days out of 7. Ruth brought food out at midday and heard the sounds of it from the house: hammers, the creak of new timber, occasional cursing from Marcus when something didn't fit the way he'd measured, Cole's voice making the specific sound it made when he was about to suggest a different approach. Caleb was different in these weeks. Not transformed, he was still watchful, still serious in the way he'd always been. Still the boy who'd sat at Ashford's table 3 months ago with his fists clenched and his jaw set and his mind already calculating threat levels. But something had shifted in the distribution of what he was carrying. He still carried a lot. He was still going to carry a lot for a long time, because certain weights don't lift all the way when you're 14 and you've done what he'd done and seen what he'd seen. But he set some of it down, small pieces, on the days when the barn was going up and there was physical work to put himself into, and the physical work was doing what physical work does when it's purposeful, giving the mind something to engage with that isn't itself. He and Cole had not talked directly about the morning of the attack. Ruth had wondered if they would, if Cole would raise it, or Caleb would, and she'd stayed out of it because it wasn't hers to manage. But she watched the way they worked together in the days after the hearing, and she noted that Cole gave Caleb the harder tasks without making a ceremony of it, the ones that required judgment as well as strength, the ones where you had to think about what you were doing while you were doing it. And she noted that Caleb accepted them without the careful neutrality he used to maintain, the armor he used to wear around everything Cole offered. One evening in the 3rd week of March, she came out to call them in for supper and found them at the corral, not working, just standing with their arms on the top rail looking at the horses. She stopped at the corner of the house and watched without being seen. Cole said something she couldn't hear. Caleb said something back. Cole nodded. Then they stood there in silence for another minute, just watching the horses. And there was nothing remarkable about it. No dramatic gesture or moment. Just two people standing at a fence in the late light, comfortable enough with each other to not need to fill the silence. She went back inside and called them from the porch instead, and they came in and washed up and sat down. And Thomas immediately began explaining a theory he'd developed about which of the new barn stalls the gray mare preferred and why. And Lily listened to this with the expression of someone who found Thomas's theories both baffling and endearing, which Ruth thought was probably the most accurate possible response. She knew she was pregnant in April. She knew it the way you know things the second time, not with the dramatic uncertainty of the first, but with a quieter recognition, the body informing the mind in plain language. She lay in bed on the morning she was certain and looked at the ceiling and thought about it for a long time before she said anything to anyone. The thing she thought about first, honestly, was fear. Not about the pregnancy itself. She'd had 3 children and known what it entailed, and was not frightened of the physical part of it. What she thought about was the shape of what this meant, the thing it said about the nature of her marriage that had started as a legal arrangement between 2 people navigating a crisis. It had not stayed a legal arrangement. She knew that. She thought Cole knew it too, though they'd been circling around the knowing with the particular caution of people who have both been through enough to understand that naming a thing changes it, and changing it means taking on the risk of losing it. They'd been careful with each other in that specific way, and the careful had gradually become warm, and the warm had become something she didn't have a clean word for. She told him on a Sunday morning when the children were outside and the house was quiet. She told him the way she told most things, plainly, without preamble, watching his face. He was very still for a moment. She watched the stillness and tried to read what was in it and found that she couldn't, not completely, which still happened sometimes. Then he said, "Are you all right?" Which was not what she'd expected him to say first, and which was exactly right. "Yes," she said. "I'm well. I wanted you to know." He looked at the table between them for a moment. Then he looked up. When I proposed the arrangement, I didn't know what it would—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this," he said, which was a kind of honesty she'd come to value specifically because it cost him something. "I know," she said. "She is. But I want to be clear that—" He stopped again. She waited. "This is not nothing to me," he said finally. "None of this is nothing to me." It was possibly the least romantic declaration she'd ever heard, and it was the one that got past her defenses completely, because it sounded like him and not like a performance of what someone was supposed to say. "I know that too," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way she'd done for Caleb in the kitchen weeks ago. Just a hand, briefly, acknowledging. Then he took it back and said, "I'll ride down to see the doctor in Caldwell Crossing this week. Make sure you have what you need." "Cole?" "What?" "I've done this 3 times. I know what I need." "Then tell me what that is," he said, "and I'll get it." She looked at him, then she gave him a list, because he was a man who did better with specific tasks than with uncertainty, and she'd learned that about him months ago and saw no reason not to use the knowledge. She told the children together that same afternoon in the main room with the spring light coming through the windows. Thomas's eyebrows went up. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet before asking questions. "Will it be a girl or a boy?" "I don't know yet," Ruth said. "Is there a way to find out before?" "Not a reliable one." He chewed on this. "I'd like a sister," he said, with the authority of someone who has thought about the topic. "I have a brother. Lily is a sister, but she's younger. An older sister might be different." "It might be another brother," Caleb said from his chair. "I'm aware of that," Thomas said, with dignity. Lily had been sitting beside Ruth the whole time, very still, in the way she sometimes got when she was processing something too big for its edges. Ruth looked down at her. "Lily?" Lily was quiet for another moment. Then, "Will it be ours?" "Yes," Ruth said. "It will be ours." Lily leaned against Ruth's side and stayed there. "Okay," she said, which was the most Lily thing she could have said. The whole complexity of the situation reduced to okay by a 7-year-old who had learned something about how to hold large things in small words. Cole, standing in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, heard all of this. Ruth saw him when she looked up, saw his face doing the thing it did when something reached him past the point where he could maintain his usual composure, the slight tension around the eyes that meant he was holding something in that he didn't know what to do with. She caught his eye and gave him nothing that could embarrass him in front of the children, just a look that acknowledged what she'd seen. He looked back and gave her the same, and they moved on. Silas's trial was held in May, in the territorial courthouse rather than the county one, because the charges had expanded during the investigation in ways that exceeded county jurisdiction. Creedy had testified to the Territorial Oversight Committee in March. The investigation into Judge Haverling had produced, among other things, a paper trail connecting Haverling's rulings in several cases to payments funneled through a land investment company that Silas was a silent partner in. Haverling had resigned before the trial. 2 of the officials in the county clerk's office had also quietly departed. Ruth testified at the trial too. It was easier the second time, though easier was a relative term. She still spent the night before in a restless half-sleep, and she still felt the familiar tightening in her chest when Greer, who had remained as Silas's attorney, began his cross-examination. But she had her thread, and she held it. What was different this time was the room itself. The territorial courthouse was larger than the county one, and the gallery was fuller, and some of the faces in it she didn't recognize at all. People from other parts of the territory who had come because Silas's reach had extended farther than Caldwell Crossing, because there were people in places she'd never been who had their own version of what had happened to the Harmon family in the Eastern Valley, to Pete Sunderland's building deal, to Margaret Haggerty's husband's business. Silas had been doing this for a long time. Ruth had known it, but seeing the room full of its consequences made it real in a different way. He was convicted on 4 counts: arson, criminal intimidation, conspiracy to commit assault, and a charge relating to his involvement in the fraudulent land dealings that the investigation had uncovered. A charge that was more complicated and more significant than the others because it had implications for several properties that had been taken under false pretenses over the preceding years. He received a sentence that would keep him in the territorial prison for the next 12 years, which meant he would be in his late 50s when he came out. If he came out, and whatever he came out to would be a territory that had moved on without him. His assets were to be liquidated as part of the resolution of the fraud case, a process that would take years, but that Creedy, who had been engaged formally as a consultant by the Oversight Committee, seemed confident would produce results. Ruth heard the sentence and sat with it. She didn't feel triumph exactly. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel, but triumph was too clean for what was actually there. Something more like the particular exhaustion that follows sustained effort, when your body finally understands the work is done and begins to release the tension it's been storing. She thought about Daniel. She thought about how he'd worried about Silas in those last months, and how the worry had been correct and he hadn't lived to see it vindicated, and there was an unfairness to that she couldn't resolve and had stopped trying to. Some things didn't resolve. You just carried them until they found a place to sit that wasn't in the way of everything else. Cole was beside her when the sentence was read. He didn't say anything, but she felt his hand find hers under the edge of the bench, and she let him hold it, and they sat there while the courtroom moved around them. The baby came in November, which brought a certain symmetry to things that Ruth noticed and said nothing about. Exactly 1 year after the auction in Caldwell Crossing. The same month, though not the same week, and a year that had covered more ground than most years managed. She was a girl. Ruth had known she would be a girl, not from any mystical sense, but from the specific way her body had handled the pregnancy differently from the boys, and from some wordless certainty she'd had since April that she'd kept to herself because announcing certainties that couldn't be verified made people nervous. She was small, but not worryingly so, and loud in the initial way of newborns who have decided the world requires their immediate assessment, and she had Ruth's coloring and Cole's stubborn set to the jaw, which was already visible and which made Cole laugh the first time he held her, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unexpected. They named her Hope, not because it was symbolic, or not only because it was symbolic, but because Ruth had been thinking about the word for months, about what it actually meant underneath its tendency to be used decoratively. Hope was not the same as optimism. Optimism was easy, a pleasant default. Hope was the thing you maintained when optimism was no longer available, when the circumstances were specifically against you, and you did it anyway, not because you were certain of the outcome, but because the alternative was to stop. Ruth had been doing that specific thing for over a year. It seemed like an appropriate name for what had come out of it. Lily, when they told her the name, said simply, "That's right," with the conviction of someone confirming a fact they'd already known. Thomas said it was a good name, but wanted assurance that he could call her something shorter if Hope turned out to be too formal for everyday use. Caleb held the baby with the careful terror of a 14-year-old who has not previously held a newborn and is unsure what the structural tolerances are, and when she grabbed his finger and held on with the surprising grip that newborns have, something in his face went very young and very open before he pulled it back under control. He didn't pull it back entirely. Ruth noticed that. Cole sat with the baby for a long time that first night, after the children were asleep and Ruth was resting. Just sat in the chair by the wood stove with Hope against his chest, not doing anything, not saying anything. Ruth could see him from the bed. He was looking down at the baby the way he looked at things when he was thinking seriously about them, and she watched him and thought about the man who had told her, one night by a campfire in November of last year, that he'd had a family and lost them, and hadn't been able to do anything about it. He was doing something about it now. That wasn't how he would have put it. He would have said he was sitting by the fire holding a baby and she should get some sleep. But she knew what she was looking at. She closed her eyes and slept, with the sound of the fire and the small weight of Hope breathing in Cole's arms, and she slept better than she had in a long time. There is something that people don't tell you about survival, and it's this. The surviving itself is not the hardest part. The hardest part is what comes after, when the immediate crisis has passed and you're left standing in the space it occupied, and you have to decide what to build there. Ruth had thought, in the worst of the past year, that what she wanted was safety. That was the goal, the thing she was running toward, a place to stand where nothing could be taken from her. But sitting in the ranch house in the spring of the year after everything, watching Lily in the yard talking to the gray mare through the fence boards, watching Thomas and Cole and a hired hand from the valley working the south field, watching Caleb split firewood with the efficient rhythm of someone who had learned from observation and then made it his own, she understood that safety wasn't the right word for what she'd found, or for what she'd wanted. What she'd found was grounding, a place that was hers, theirs, not because circumstances had deposited her here and she was making do, but because all of them, herself and Cole and the children, had gone through something together, and the going through had made it real. You couldn't manufacture that. You couldn't buy it. The most you could do was be honest enough and brave enough and stubborn enough to stay when staying was hard, and see what it became. It was imperfect. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own accounting. Cole was not an easy man to live with in the ways that private people are not easy. He went quiet at the wrong times. He was too proud about asking for help. He had a temper that he managed better than he once had, but that still showed its edge when he was exhausted or when he thought he'd made a mistake. Ruth was not easy either. She made decisions quickly and didn't always bring him in before she'd already decided, and she had a particular stubbornness that sometimes looked like confidence and sometimes was just stubbornness, and she knew the difference but didn't always correct it. They disagreed about things, and sometimes the disagreements were not pleasant, and they worked through them in the way that adults work through disagreements when they've decided the thing between them is worth more than winning. Caleb was not fine in any simple sense. He was 15 in March, and the things he'd done and seen in the preceding year had changed him in ways that wouldn't fully show themselves for years. Some of those changes would turn out to be strengths, and some of them would be places where he was more careful than he needed to be, or less. And he would have to figure out which was which as he went. He talked to Cole about it, sometimes, in the oblique way that men and boys talked about things that didn't have clean names, during the hours of work when the talking was secondary to the doing. It wasn't enough, probably. It was what was available, and Caleb was using it, and Ruth let it be what it was. Thomas turned 11 in April, and had by this point accumulated an understanding of the ranch's operations that impressed the hired hands and occasionally unnerved Cole, who had been running cattle operations for 15 years and found himself explaining decisions to a child who would then quietly point out a variable he'd missed. Thomas would either become a rancher or an engineer or something that combined both, and whichever it was, it would be thorough and it would be organized, and the people around him would sometimes want to throttle him for being right at inconvenient moments. Lily turned 8 in September, and she had her voice back entirely by then. Not the same voice as before, because she wasn't the same person as before, but her own voice, the one that belonged to who she was now. She talked to the animals most freely, which was not unusual for children who'd been quiet a long time, because animals didn't require you to perform